Now, opening in English, we have the privilege of having a great journalist and writer, Matt Rendell, from the UK. And what inspired us to speak was his book, one of the first, about all the noise on Marco Pantani death, the accidental death of a cyclist. And the big question, was it drugs? Was it the mafia? Was it the aliens? Whatever happened to Marco Pantani? And I must say that I was not a big fan of Marco, maybe because of all that at the time I was rooting a little bit for Lance before all the mess that he did. But on preparing for this program, I went back to watch his races and some of his footage, and I just fell in love because the way he pedals, the way he attacks, the way he attracted passions and crowds on Italy, but at the same time, after his fall, all the weight that he carried on his weight, on being the fallen angel, which is a word of another book from the great Fausto
We're
Coppi.
bothering him. Yeah.
And here with us, Matt, please enlighten us and tell us the truth, nothing more the truth, about your
I don't
knowledge
think he can do
and
this.
experience on Marco Pantani.
Well, it's very interesting, Alvaro, Leandro. It's wonderful to be here with you, and we live in such strange times, and to me, part of the strangeness of the times we live in, these times when, the official version of events is like automatically suspect and not to be believed, and the craziest theory, however ridiculous, is to be preferred to anything that a police investigation or an investigative journalist or a university professor. These are all sort of the official versions of events, and so those are fake news and can't be believed. And in many respects, the Pantani story it is right at the beginning of all that. And I'll hold up a version of my book. There we are. You can see it. This is the version with the pink cover. Okay, the original had a white cover. This version came out in 2014, 2015 on the after the 10th anniversary of Marco Pantani's death. And the 10th anniversary was used in Italy mostly by the television channels that belonged to the Berlusconi family, the Mediaset channels, but also by Sky and by Rai, but mostly by the Berlusconi channels to try and convince the Italian public that Marco Pantani had been murdered. And before we even talk about whether it's true or not, that a cocaine addict who had overdosed 5 times and been saved by his friends, overdosed, and then died. So that's got to be hypothesis number 1. He'd had 5 overdoses, and he would probably have died if he hadn't been saved by his friends who knew where to find him. On the 6th occasion, no one knew where he was, and he died. And actually, if they had known where he was, maybe, 3 weeks later or 4 weeks later, he would have died because he would have had another overdose. Okay, so we set all that aside. The really curious question is, what comfort is it to anyone if he was murdered? I fail to understand, but obviously a lot of people out there find that comforting. So it's a very strange, as I say, a strange world we live in.
I can suppose that the cocaine was the thing, and I agree with you. Wasn't at that time, wasn't will be few days later. But I agree with you. But we need a better storytelling about him. We need a hero here.
Yeah.
Next year, Tour de France will go on his city. And do you think we are imploding our script? But do you think the ASO, the FCS, or all the organizations has some regrets on how they care of Pantani on that moment when
It's very difficult. Cycling is big business, and really it's interesting. The other cyclist of the time, who you mentioned, Lance Armstrong, really grew the sport, and
yeah, for
really
sure.
post Lance Armstrong, the sport was, I mean, 10 times bigger than it had been in the 90s. And what cycling is now, I mean, I remember we used to go to Alpe d'Huez. I worked with the British television during the Tour de France. We would arrive at Alpe d'Huez the day before the stage, and you'd go into your accommodation, and it would smell all musty and sort of damp, because it's all been closed for 5 months after the ski season. And then, so you'd have the night before the stage and the night after the stage, there'd be people in Alpe d'Huez, and then Alpe d'Huez would close down again until the winter. Now, today, all the way through June and July, there are cycle tourists and visitors in Alpe d'Huez for 2 months. And that didn't exist in the 1990s. So cycling's big business. We know what big business is about. It's about margins. It's about turning everything to a profit. And Marco Pantani has certainly been turned to a profit. There's the film that I'm partly responsible for. That's the accidental death of a cyclist. It's interesting. This is not the film of my book. The formula that's it's far too small to see here, but all the credits here. The formula is inspired by The Death of Marco Pantani by Matt Rendell, because my book is far more forensic. It's very investigative. It's got all the data from the police, the many police investigations into Marco Pantani. The film is much more about nostalgia and about the more general kind of predicament of this wonderfully talented, extraordinarily talented child who is then just kind of mashed up by the sporting system. But without going too into specifics, my book is very much about specifics.
And maybe let's just to put everybody on the same page. Marco Pantani was born in 1970, and when adult, he was 1 meter and 72 centimeters, weighing 58 kilos. He started racing when he was 11 on a photocopy kind of a club, 1981. And he had his glory years from 1994 to 1998, where in 1996 he got a terrible accident and almost was ruling out of a professional world, but came back kicking. And on 1998 was one of the few men that ever lived that won the Giro and the Tour in the same year. So in his company, there is Anquetil, Merckx, Coppi. And then he became Il Pirata because of his bald head, because of his ring on the ear. And that was when cycling, in a sense, first, on his prior years, he had Mercatone Uno, which was a supermarket as a sponsor. The owner of the supermarket says on one of the films that his business grew 30% after he started sponsoring Marco Pantani. Marco Pantani is the fastest time climbing Alpe d'Huez. Actually, when I was watching some of his movies, is exciting, if not scary, to see him, Jurich, Lance, going up and needing to brake before the turn because they were going up so fast. They needed to brake before the turn. That's something unimaginable for somebody that didn't watch. And on 98, there was the big event of the Fascina affair just before the tour. That created a wave of suspicion and investigations, which culminated on 1999, Marco Pantani being expelled from the Giro when he had chances to win. So just to put in context, and then he died when he was 34 in a hotel, in a small hotel, and that's a contest that this God, this supreme athlete, this inspiration for many, even bigger than soccer players in football players in Italy, became a fragile, self-destructive human being.
Yeah, it's a very good summary, Alvaro. And to add to that, I think is that cycling is the paradigmatic Italian sport. So we might say, you might think, well, Pantani was to Italy as Armstrong was to the USA, but actually no. You compare Pantani with something absolutely typically American, like Michael Jordan and basketball. This was a colossally important sportsman, very easily recognizable, and there are a number of misconceptions about his career. What we do know now, many years later, we've known since 2006 that Pantani was a client of Eufemiano Fuentes, the doctor at the center of the Operación Puerto investigation, blood doping. We know that Pantani paid him 40,000 euros for training programs based on the use of EPO. We know that a French Senate inquiry ordered the blood samples from the 1998 Tour de France to be analysed, and among the riders who had EPO in their biological samples was Pantani. We know that in 1995, when you see in October 1995, Pantani had this terrible crash that smashed up one of his legs and left him with one leg shorter than the other for the rest of his life. And in hospital after that crash, his red blood cell count was measured at 60.8%, which is very, very high indeed. And that in the days following that reading, his red blood cell count dropped so far that he needed a blood transfusion to save his life. So this is a rider who, it could almost be said that he died of doping because the EPO injected switched off his natural EPO production. And so there are many grounds for saying that we know that he was a doped cyclist at his best.
We know that. So I feel uncomfortable every time we talk about 1999 because people used to say that he wasn't fair to put him out of the race. But now, looking behind, and how do you describe him? How do you feel when someone used to say that he's the best climber we saw in cycling?
I think he's the most, in my view, in my experience, which goes back to, I started following cycling in 1991, and he's certainly the most exciting climber to watch. There's a kind of muscular, these repeated accelerations. The famous stage of Monte Campione in the 1998 Giro d'Italia, when he and Pavel Tonkov, who was the previous year's winner, they kind of dueled on what's a very, very hard and long climb. And Pantani accelerated maybe 14 or 15 times. And there's no experience. I mean, think of the greatest footballer you've ever seen. Yeah, I've got to be careful speaking to Brazilians about this, but
Don't worry.
And the way that it just inspires you, that it just has you, your own muscles. Yeah, go on. And you get very, very excited. And that was what Pantani was like. Now, there are grounds for saying that the euphoria that we felt watching Pantani ride is the product of the doping substances in his body. So we are doped at one remove, because that very exciting body movement is only possible because of those doping substances. That's definitely an argument that can be made.
Matt, many argue that doping was a playing field, that everybody was doping. Actually, doping has long standing and maybe started to call my attention after Tom Simpson on the late 60s died on a heart attack in the Alps of France. But when you say his panache, his movement, all his peers, as you just reported, that the French senator asked the 98 test, 18 riders of the peloton were confirmed. What made Pantani special? Taking aside the moral aspect of doping, what made him special? Because Lance Armstrong has said that APO is a 20% increase. So you take APO and you're going to be 20% more resilient on your endurance. But Mark was taking, Bjarne Riis was taking, Lance was taking, Jurek was taking, Tonkov possibly was taking. Why was Pantani able to even then fly?
Well, I think huge natural talent, that small, very, very powerful physique. I was watching the accidental death of a cyclist on Monday night, and just the physique he had in 1998 and 1999 is extraordinary, and I think that training techniques assisted by doping, you were able to just train so hard, and I think that also there were Marco had, and there's documentary proof of this. Marco had he was a vulnerable child and he was a vulnerable young man. And in fact, the doping doctors who pushed him into a situation where he was alienated from his own victories by the fact that he was being given heavy doping products. So even his own wins weren't entirely his own. Okay, there were underlying psychological issues that gave him, in a strange way, in the very strange world of elite sport, gave him the advantage. He was impulsive. He was very impulsive. Yeah. And that meant that he was unreadable as a rider. He would attack at the very foot of the climb with absolutely no fear. And that impulsiveness in everyday life might make it difficult to live with other people. But in elite sport, it gave him an advantage. He had a sense of entitlement, that as kind of arrogance, a kind of narcissistic sort of arrogance. And in everyday life, that might make it difficult to live with other people. But in cycling, a leader domestic system, where the leader can have a glass of wine with his meal and eat with his girlfriend, but the domestiques can't. And where the winner is invited onto a podium to be adored, to be worshipped and to be applauded, and other people aren't. That sense of entitlement might be pathological in normal lives, but in elite sport, it's a huge advantage. It's motivating, and it means that you don't lose your nerve. It means that you feel that you have a right to this adulation and so on. So there are lots of parts of Marco's psychological makeup that suited him for incredible success in elite sport that in everyday life might have made his life, and did make his life, very difficult. So it's an interesting story. It's a story about what sport has become in our societies.
So what you said is that Marco had more a lack of fear than really courage.
Well, I think. I mean, many people say, and I think it was Ivan Gotti who eventually was awarded, who won the 1999 Giro d'Italia, who said, "Yeah, Pantani." Most of us, when we go into the mountains, we're afraid of the mountains. Pantani wasn't afraid. So yeah, that's certainly what he said. Avoiding the question.
Now let's get to the conspiracy theories.
Okay.
How come all the mafia involvement come from? And you did a very solid journalistic work, which is related in your book, about bringing the facts, not the great stories that sell newspapers, but the facts.
Yeah. I should have written the conspiracy theories. I'd have made a lot more money, but I'm a simple-minded man. Yeah, well, I'll tell you a funny story. And it's got to do with reliable and unreliable witnesses. What is a reliable witness? When someone comes to you and says, look, I'll tell you, this is what happened. Someone came up to me. This is a guy called Renato Valansasca, okay, who is a bank robber and someone involved in criminal acts that left people dead, and not someone you really want to be inviting to dinner and associating with. He was on a he was in prison in Milan, and what he says happened is that someone from the Neapolitan mafia wanted to form some kind of alliance with Valansasca. And he said, listen, I've got a gift for you from the Camorra, from the Neapolitan mafia. Make a bet that Pantani will not win the Giro d'Italia. Okay? And if you make that bet, you'll make a lot of money. And Valansasca says, well, hold on, how is Pantani not going to win the Giro d'Italia? And this mafioso said, this member of the mafia said, he will not make it to Milan. Okay, so Valansasca presents this theory to Tonina Pantani, to Marco's mother, after Pantani's death. He tells this story to the police, and the police say to him, okay, who said this to you? And he said, no, I'll tell you if you give me a reduction in my sentence. Okay. Okay. And then later, Valansasca has been given parole, so he's allowed to come in and out. He has certain days when he's allowed 1 day a week, 2 days a week. He's allowed out of prison. He goes into a supermarket, and as he's leaving, the security guard said, what's in your pockets? And Valansasca says, nothing in my pockets. So he says, empty your pockets. And Valansasca pulls out 2 pairs of underpants. Okay? And so he's stopped, and he has to go back to prison because you're not allowed to steal things when you're on day release from prison. And what he said is that the Camorra, the Neapolitan mafia, obviously sent someone into the supermarket, and this person stole the underpants. They put them in his pocket, and they framed him so that he would go back to prison. And the proof is that the underpants were the wrong size. The underpants were 2 sizes too large.
It's a lovely storytelling.
It's a great story. But I mean, what this has to do with any truth. And in 2016, I think some police surveillance recordings of telephone calls, recorded a guy called Angelo, I think, Tolomelli, who was a member of one mafia clan, talking to another guy called La Torre, who's a member of another clan. And Tolomelli says to La Torre, "Oh yeah, it happened. It happened. We framed we had Pantani removed from the race. Now I don't know what the point of all this is. 17 years after Madonna di Campiglio, this conversation doesn't seem to make any sense to me. But the fact is that if I'm a technician and I take the blood out of Pantani's arm, and the mafia say you need to manipulate the blood so that his red blood cell count is more than 51%, so that he's removed from the race. Okay, if that's me, I take a lot of plasma out of the tube because I don't want my wife and my children and my to be hurt. So I take a lot of. So he ends up with like a blood count of 80%. But he had 53%, and I think it would be very, very difficult to manipulate blood in that way. To have Pantani, and it doesn't seem to be a mafia method.
Was a B sample at that moment? They test again?
Yeah, but they test this. What you can't do, it's the same sample that gets tested, and they tested the same sample 10 times.
Okay.
Because they knew that this was going to be. They tested it once, it was positive. They checked the code against the name. Oh God, this is Pantani. We can't mess this up. Okay, so they tested it, I think, 4 times on one machine, 4 times on another machine, and then later it was tested twice more in a hospital laboratory, not in a hotel, but on the road, in a hotel, in a laboratory, and it was always the same result. And what you can't do then is say to the athlete, we need to take another blood sample from you to check that the first, because he might have manipulated his blood afterwards, and then you'd have a manipulated sample. So it's always the same sample that's tested. But the idea that the mafia has this blood sample manipulated to remove some, there are easier ways of removing someone from a race. And what's happening now is that the blood technicians, there were 3 of them from the Santa Ana hospital in Como, they're kind of perfectly normal guys going to do a job with a contract with the hospital. And now, so this is 24 years later, the Pantani family legal team is going after the blood collectors. Okay, they're accusing them of, they're saying that they were maybe under threat by the mafia, but they're comparing 2 situations which are not comparable. In 1980, Maradona, who was a god in Naples, as we know, won the league with Naples, won Serie A with Napoli. Okay, and the story goes that everyone in Naples put money, bet on Naples winning Serie A. Naples won Serie A, so the Camorra, the mafia, who was running all the illegal betting, they went bankrupt because they had to pay out so much money to people who bet. Well, I mean, that's clearly, someone who doesn't know how to run betting, okay? But what they say is that in 1999, Pantani, everyone bet that Pantani was like Maradona at Napoli. Yeah, Pantani was always going to win the Giro d'Italia. So the betting syndicates of the Neapolitan mafia took a lot of money on Pantani, and if Pantani had won, the mafia would have gone bankrupt again. Okay, but I think there are lots of things to say to that, but one of them is that Maradona and Napoli in Naples were the biggest thing in the world. Okay, Naples is not a cycling city. There are very few cyclists from Naples. There was very little betting on cycling in 1999. It was very difficult to place a bet on cycling in 1999. And I don't think Pantani is comparable with Maradona. And I think there's just so much wrong with this story that, and the other thing is that we now know that Pantani was a doped cyclist. We know that. We know in 1998 we've got all the files from Professor Conconi's laboratory where Pantani was doped. They're all in my book. All the graphs are there. We know that Pantani was doped. The very simple, clear, obvious explanation is that Pantani was ruled out of the race because he'd been using EPO. It's as simple as that. Simple.
So we need to talk to the other mafia.
Okay.
We need to talk about UCI and race organized.
Yeah.
Because
Professor Conconi and the doctors who
works for UCI and then for the riders, right? We can saw that this on the movie and maybe, but he won Giro 98, Tour 98, 4 stages at 99, and then he was expelled out. But he was not playing on the level field. Yeah. He was above he was beyond any line. How much UCI or these authorities could work on that to remove Pantani and don't be so exposed, right, on this kind of rider? Do you believe in this kind of mafia? They need to stop Pantani to a fair place, right?
And let me add to, do you have any information or theory why they did it when they did it? Because taking Marco out of the Giro, in the middle of the Giro when he was looking to win, of course, it will cause a great commotion in the country of Italy and the vision of Giro, but most importantly in Italy. So for RCS, who organizes the Giro, for the UCI, there was a decision why to make it there. It was probably known among the professional cycles that Mark was doping as everybody else, or most of everybody else. Why do it then and not wait until the Giro was finished or before the Giro started?
Well, I mean, there was no decision. The decision was made by Marco's blood values. That's when the decision was made. And the blood tests are determined by rules. So there were blood tests according to a schedule laid down in the race rules and the UCI rules. So there was no decision, we're going to throw him out tomorrow. It was quite simply that, Madonna at Cesenatico earlier in the 1999 race, he tested very, very high, but he was okay. But it was within the 50% limit. But at Madonna di Campiglio, he simply, what appears to have happened, very simply, is that Pantani's red blood cell count was very high, and that was deliberate because that made him a stronger cyclist. In the morning, the blood testers, the previous year, Pantani had been the first rider to be tested on the penultimate morning of the race. In 1999, he was one of the last 3 riders to be tested, or he was a much later. He was, instead of it being at 6 o'clock in the morning, it was at 10 to 8 in the morning. So it's possible that at 6 o'clock in the morning, his blood, he had drunk lots of liquid. He might have had plasma or hemocell added to his blood to reduce the concentration of red blood solids. And then the testers didn't arrive and didn't arrive and didn't arrive. Marco goes to the toilet and pisses out the extra liquid. So his blood level goes up. The doctors arrive, they test his red blood cell count, and it's high, because if they'd been there maybe at 6 o'clock in the morning, he would have a red blood cell count of 48. But by
So what you say is that one factor is an accident because of the strategies that doping athletes use not to get caught, or when they expect to be measured. And by this time change of 2 hours, Pantani was caught because he wasn't planning to be tested at 8 o'clock, but rather 6 o'clock, and that made the difference. And that is when
that's a likely scenario. And his team doctor, Roberto Rempi, was seen past midnight leaving the hotel with an Asian-looking hostess, going to a party. Manuela Ronchi, Pantani's manager, saw Rempi at a party at something past midnight, and she comments in her book she thought it was unprofessional for the team doctor to be there. He apparently had not returned to the hotel by 4:30 in the morning. He is not described as being present at the blood test at 10 to 8 in the morning. So the team doctor wasn't there. Pantani could well have been panicking, saying, look, where's the doctor? Where's the dog? I need hemocell. I need something to dilute my blood. And instead, there was no one there. So there was a kind of misfunction in the team. And that looks like the most likely scenario.
So you answer my question, because I will ask you about that, because something was wrong on this process, because he know what he need to do, and it's easy to know that when he won 98 both races and was winning for the second time at the Giro. But so why Pantani was so angry with the Omerta, with the caravan or the scenario after that? Because we know that he was using something illegal. He knows that too, but he felt betrayed.
Yeah. Well, I think that after the 1998 Tour de France, he was described as having saved the Tour de France and having saved cycling and having brought this kind of reintroduced the heroic dimension to the sport. So I think that there was a sense of, as I say, entitlement and a sense of I am cycling, and I think that it's certainly from his point of view, the 1999 Giro was sort of famous because no breakaway ever won a stage. The sprint stages were won by the sprinters, by Cipollini and the other sprinters. The mountain stages were won by Pantani, and there was nothing else. So if you were, if you were kind of 20 out of the 23 or 24 teams there, you were getting nothing. At most, you were getting someone in a breakaway and some pictures on the television, but winning no stages at all. So, and Pantani was criticised for this. And we know that when he went to Madonna di Campiglio, one of the team staff, when he reached the hotel after the stage, one of the team staff said to him, Marco, what have you done? You weren't supposed to win today. Okay. So certainly he was criticized for that because that's the way cycling works. It's about sponsorship. It's about, so certainly people weren't happy. The other teams weren't happy that Pantani was winning everything. He took the kind of Eddie Merckx line, which is no presents. Okay. But at the moment in which, it's like to me, it's like a 5-year-old with chocolate round his mouth. Okay. Who says, I haven't seen the cookies, it's okay. He's caught. And instead, there's an expression in English, and I don't know how it would be in Portuguese. We say, it's a fair cop. And it's when the police arrive, I'm in your bedroom stealing your wallet, okay? The police arrive, and I don't say, but I didn't do anything, I say...
Yeah, in Portuguese, the term is... In Portuguese, the term is lipstick on your underwear.
Yes, there we go. Lipstick on your. There you go. There you go. Okay, so he's got lipstick on his underwear, but instead of saying, "You've caught me," he says, "It's they're out to get me. I detect a plot behind this." But as I say, this is the 5-year-old with chocolate round his mouth saying, "I didn't eat the cookies," and I think it's a bit of human nature there.
Matt, you spend a lot of time studying, investigating Marco. And you mentioned before that he had a troubled childhood. Is there any record of he abusing of substances in parallel to cycling, despite doping?
Certainly,
despite the big overabuse on cocaine after his fallen on 99.
Yes, I think there's some smoking of marijuana when he was a teenager, when he was a young man. Some of that's difficult to avoid. Anywhere these days, difficult to avoid on Rimini, on the Italian Riviera. And in many ways, he's a product of the Riviera. Cocaine is very, very easily available on the Italian Riviera. And something about Italian culture, but not just Italian culture, thinks that there's something kind of sophisticated about taking cocaine. And there was... he seems to have been persuaded that cocaine allowed you to see beneath the surface of things and see the reality. But the reality, as I say, reality from the point of view of someone who believes that they're invulnerable, who possibly believes that they're the beneficiary of some kind of agreement, that it is the whole sport has agreed that Marco Pantani gets a free pass for his doping, okay, because he saved cycling in 1998, and of course that didn't exist. And then a straight line tends to be drawn these days. Well, understandably, Marco's parents, with whom it's impossible not to have the deepest sympathy. Okay, they've lost a son. They don't want to believe that their son was a doped athlete. They don't want to believe that their son was a drug addict. And so, of course, they do everything they can and have done since his death to persuade themselves
adjust
and the rest
narrative.
Of the world. Yeah, to adjust the narrative. So, in the end, he was found dead in a room that was locked from the inside with a barricade of, a microwave oven and other items of furniture barricaded behind the door. And someone said, one of the great Italian sports journalists, Gianni Mura, commented that a body is found behind a locked door, a door locked from the inside. This is the basic scenario of every great crime story. Okay, so there's a sense in which the fact that the door was locked from the inside becomes a form of proof that he was murdered, when it's the opposite. But
yeah,
and the the doctor who performed the autopsy collected from that room 23 objects, okay? And he tested 9 of them, and they all had traces of cocaine. There were traces of cocaine in everything in that room, okay? And 9 of these objects were tested, and they all had traces of cocaine. And he didn't test the rest of the objects because it was clear what he was going to find. And one of them was a mineral water bottle. So the theory coming from the family, the Pantani family and legal team, is that this mineral water bottle, which was never tested, the killers must have dissolved cocaine in the water so that it was very concentrated with cocaine. And then they forced Marco to drink the water. And it's brilliant because this is a form of death that has never happened in all the millions of years of history of the world. And if I was a mafia hitman, I'd want to use a tried and tested method of killing someone,
Right.
not something that's never been heard before.
It could not work.
And it can't work because for kind of 3 reasons, really. One is that it's very, very bitter cocaine. So you would involuntarily have fought against it, but there were no bruising. There was no bruising to Pantani's mouth or tongue that suggested he was resisting having this water put in his mouth. 2, it's a very powerful anesthetic. So very quickly you would not be able to swallow. So they couldn't have put this water in your body. And 3, this very alkaline solution would have left burn marks in the stomach, and the doctors who'd performed the autopsy would have seen the burn marks in the stomach. So that didn't happen. And the idea that you needed to force a cocaine addict, a very wealthy cocaine addict who was used to buying 90 or 100 grams. His doctor said that he suspected Marco used 100 grams of cocaine per week. Okay, so huge amounts. So, and Pantani was in Rimini for one reason alone, which was to buy cocaine from his supplier. And he had run away from his parents and his manager on the 31st of January, 2 weeks before he was found dead. He'd run away from them because they were insisting he needed to go and get treatment to stop taking cocaine, and he didn't want to stop taking cocaine. Okay, so the idea that that person who's already OD'd 5 times has to be forced to OD a 6th time it's not even laughable. It's a pathetic story.
Matt, on Pantani's use of cocaine, does his girlfriend, Christina, if I'm not mistaken, have any role on exposing him more to drugs?
I don't think so. No, I don't think. I think there was. I mean, drugs are easily available on the Italian Riviera. Marco liked to go out on a Friday night and go to places. He had friends who used cocaine in small amounts. As far as I can see, at one point, Marco gives Christina, that their relationship is falling apart. He gives her a very expensive Mercedes car. She takes the car. She drives it back to Pantani's house, leaves the car with the keys, and goes away. I think. I feel that she behaved as honourably as she could in the very difficult circumstances of having a very famous drug addict as a boyfriend. I think the parents did everything they could, but what can you do? And I think also Manuela Ronchi, the agent, made mistakes, but which of us wouldn't have made mistakes? It's, working with people who are
No,
suffering
in a
from.
different dimension. There's
Yeah,
stories everywhere. Michael Jackson and everybody else.
absolutely.
But let me flip back. You
Yeah,
had a privileged position on reporting and doing journalism on cycling for many decades.
yeah, yeah,
Something that calls attention from whoever doesn't really know cycling
yeah.
is how come a professional athlete who should take almost care to his health because his body is his wheel of survival or of economic survival to take drugs, either doping drugs or recreational drugs.
I mean, it's an impossible question to answer. I think that there's certainly there are many cases, sadly, where doping, the kind of professional drug taking, becomes a gateway to other types of abuse. The famous Stilnox years in Cofidis, where the riders would take it's essentially a sleeping pill. But if you can resist falling asleep, if you overdose on Stilnox, you resist falling asleep, and then it becomes a party drug, okay? And you have it becomes hallucinogenic. And so riders who are taking effectively stimulants to improve their athletic performance, they often need to take sleeping pills in order to get to sleep. Now, when the sleeping pills turn out to be hallucinogens, it's the clearest gateway that there is. And in December 2003, Jose Maria Jimenez died in a clinic in Madrid, having had very similar problems to Pantani's, and that kind of destroyed Pantani's faith in clinics. So he didn't want to go to a clinic because another prominent climber had died in a clinic. I should say one more thing. The autopsy doctor, Professor Giuseppe Fortuni, told me that cocaine is not a good way to die. Okay, if you take heroin, you sleep to death. Cocaine is a stimulant, and it's a painful and horrific death. Now, Pantani's body was found in what's described as a pool of blood, but he was on ceramic tiles. Actually, there was the same amount of blood as you get to fill an espresso cup. Yeah, but this blood was on ceramic tiles, and there's a movement of the arm, and it's described in the final autopsy in 2015 by Professor Tagliaro as consistent with rigor mortis. Okay, that as the body dies, your arms come up towards you because the muscles tighten, and this is a process of dying. But if you add to the fact that this is a very painful and tortured death, there are movements of the body left, and the pattern is left in the blood, that really has nothing to do with people entering the room and moving the body, and there are, I mean, there's a whole list of very, very basic misunderstandings that have been repeated for nearly 20 years, and they're repeated in the document in 2019, so 15 years after his death, that the Pantani family new legal team submitted to the Anti-Mafia Commission in Rome. And we're now back where we started, because the Anti-Mafia Commission, it sounds like it's going to be a load of like intelligence officers and policemen. It's a bunch of politicians. And it's a bunch of politicians dominated by the Movimento Cinque Stelle, yeah? This movement political party founded in 2009, and the basis of their beliefs is we do not believe the official version.
But people used to like this version, right? To not believe that he was doped first when he was fell out was a mafia thing, and then
Or to choose not to believe.
Yeah,
choose to not believe.
Yeah.
Choose not believe.
Yeah.
Choose to do a better storytelling, and now we can contemplate Pantani victories without this
disturbance.
Things, no?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, this is one of the things that sport gives. Sport is where, in the old, 500 years ago, our lives were full of miracles. And the Virgin Maria would appear on the hillside, and the holy water would save us from illness, and we wouldn't need vaccines, And now we don't have miracles anymore. What do we do with miracles? We put them in sport. Sport is one of the places where the miracles live now. And so, of course, we don't believe in these things. We believe in sport is where we go for our miraculous stories.
And what we learned with this, cycling learned something about with Pantani. I suppose that maybe Pogacar and Vingegaard are sharing the victories, but no one is dominating too much to be on focus. But on the good way, we learned something with this Pantani story.
I don't know if we learned. Alvaro, you tell me if we've learned anything. I think it's very simple. If you take anyone and you say, here's a free pass, here's a free pass. You can commit today the perfect crime. No one will catch you, okay, and it will make you rich, okay? And that's what cycling was in the 1990s. You had all these new technologies, genetics. So you had EPO, you had human growth hormone, you had insulin-like growth factor, you had other factors and other products that were completely undetectable, and they made you faster. They made you faster and they made you stronger, okay? That's the perfect crime. There's no test. That's the perfect
and
crime.
richer.
And richer, and a lot richer. And so, I'm the idiot. I had the opportunity to write the perfect crime, and instead I made the foolish mistake of writing the truth. Okay, if I'd written some crazy bullshit fairy story, okay, I wouldn't be talking to you. I'd be.
We disagree. But thanks to you. Thanks to you, we have some facts to share with your audience.
It's perfect. I think we should talk to you other times. We would love to listen about your Colombian experience, because I think we can connect the facts that Pantani was there to the world champion and become third. But now we need to put an end on this episode, and I as I used to believe, we couldn't put an end on this discussion. I know who will send messages to us at Gregário to contest these things. I know the names who will disagree with you, but was a love chat with you. And Pantani, I used to say that how I start this talk, it's a difficult balance about exciting rider. That's something we agree here. He was a lovely guy to watch on TV, and the fair play and the clean sport, because it's too opposite. It's difficult to arrange all this stuff. But it was a pleasure to talk to you, someone who knows a lot about cycling and insight to share with us.
It's a real pleasure to be with both of you. Obrigado. A próxima vez vamos fazer no português.
Ah, muito bem, Matt.
Fechado.